It's a brand new day to do some VR development. Put on your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to get pretty exciting today because what we're doing is called VR camera setup, additive scenes. When you're setting up your VR camera, there's a couple ways to do it. You might have a main menu. You might have a couple of levels. It might just be one VR scene. So when you're setting that up, when you're setting your camera up, there's a few ways to do it. Here you can see there's a VR main, which used to be called cardboard main, or this might be, just your VR camera or your player prefab. And I have one in the main menu scene, and if you look in level 1, there's another one here. And if you look in level 2, there's another one. And those are, even though they're prefabs, they're each individual instances. And for example, if I set this VR mode enabled off, which can be done at runtime, that doesn't happen on the one in the main menu. When I rotate my head, for example, the main camera, and you'll see the rotation of the head changes. The head in the main menu still is sitting at 0, 0, 0, and if I were to load up the main menu, my head rotation would change even though I actually didn't turn my head. So there's a few different ways to address this. I'm going to start with a brand new project and show you how to set up a VR camera using additive scenes in Unity, which is a really good way to do it. So I have the Google VR SDK. I'm going to import Google VR. I'm not developing for iOS, so I can take the check mark off of that under the plugins folder. And before I go too far, let me set up my build settings. I'm developing for Android. I want to use ASTC compression. And in the player settings, I need to put landscape left. And multi-threaded rendering is fine. I need to put a new bundle identifier in here. And minimum API level 16. I only am developing for ARM processors. Android TV compatibility is not necessary. That looks fine for now. Let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do here is save my scene. I'm going to create a new folder called Scenes. Before I save my scene, I'm going to set up the lighting. We got the Skybox. We want baked ambient global illumination. We don't want to use real-time global illumination. We want to use baked global illumination with a 40's fine, but for testing, I'm just going to lower it down to 10. And I'm going to use non-directional light maps. One, because it's going to be quicker, and two, because sometimes it works great for mobile VR. And I'm not going to automatically bake. Now that that's set up, I'm ready to save my scene. And I'm going to name this scene VR main, because this scene only should contain VR main prefab and maybe a game controller. Now I want to have the same lighting settings in all of my scenes, so I'm going to use save scene as, and I'm going to create a new scene called level 01, which represents the content. And this scene, VR main, represents the player prefab. So in this scene, we're actually not even going to use a Skybox. We're not going to use a directional light. And we do need a camera, but I'm going to use the Google VR prefab called GVR main. And I want to have a plane. And I want the camera to be at 2. But because in this scene we're only going to have the VR main prefab, we're going to move this plane to the other scene. Level 01 is where that's going to go. So I just have my VR main here. I can set my options. I want to be able to see the Skybox, so I'm going to clear flag to the Skybox. Even though there's not a Skybox set up in this scene, but there is a Skybox in level 01, and this is where I'm going to create that plane. I'm also going to create a cube. And for the child of the cube, I'm going to create a 3D text object. And I'm going to say level 02. Not because this is level 2, this is level 1, but the box is going to load level 2. And I want to put the alignment to the center, and I'm going to make the character size a lot smaller. And it looks like it needs to get moved by 0.5. There we go. So I have a cube that says level 2 that's going to load level 2. Let me create a new folder for some materials. I want some green for the grass. Somewhere around there looks good. And I'm going to use Control D to make a new one and name it brown. I guess this is a crate, as all games need their crates. Okay. So, everything's looking good. Let's set up the lighting. We don't want to use real-time lighting for mobile VR. We're going to use baked. Soft shadows is fine. And I'm going to go to my lighting tab. And because I've already set everything up, I should be ready to click the build. And what you're going to see happen here is no light maps. So why don't we have any light maps? And the reason why is because we haven't set anything in the scene to light map static. We could just set light map static on these objects, but I'm going to put them completely static, which sets all of the static attributes. Now we're ready to bake some lighting. Okay, so my lighting's baked. We are ready to get going. Unity has recently introduced additive scenes both in the editor and at runtime. So what I can do here is open up my VR main scene, which only has my camera, no lights, no skybox or anything, and I can bring in level 1 into the scene. Now I have both of these scenes open, and I can't see the sky because VR main is the active scene, so I'm going to set level 1 to the active scene, and now we have both. The problem is my level 1 includes a main camera. That needs to go. And press play. We can't see a skybox, so I'm going to show how to fix that in just a second. I'm going to unload level 1. Actually, I'm going to remove it completely so that we're just left with our VR main scene. And I'm going to create a new game object called Game Controller. Unity has a tag pre-built in for Game Controller, so I'm going to set that. And I might as well put this where it belongs at 000. I'm going to create a new component called Game Controller, which is going to be a new C# script. So what we can do here is we can say public static game controller, and I'm going to call it control. And I want to use the awake function which is a mono behavior. I'm going to use awake to populate the game control by saying control is equal to this, which is myself, this game controller object. Traditionally, we would have had to set don't destroy, unload, and some other options, but because VR main scene is never going to be unloaded, we don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to make a new public IEnumerator called load level, and we're going to have to pass in a string scene name. So the reason why I'm using an IEnumerator is so the first thing that I can do is a yield return new wait for end of frame. Whatever's being processed on the current frame needs to be finished up before we go into loading a new level. And I want to use the scene manager, and I can see it's not there, so I need to say using Unity engine dot scene management. Now I can use scene manager dot load scene asynchronously. Scene, we can pass in the scene name, which comes in here, and we can use the load scene mode here. So for the load scene mode, I'm going to use load scene mode dot additive, which is the same mode that we used to add it in here, where it's just going to add it to the current Unity scene. And then let's say I'm going between level 1 and level 2. I'm going to need to onload level 1. So let's make a new IEnumerator called onload levels. And the reason why it's levels is it may unload multiple levels depending on your game. So I'm going to pass in a string exception. And the reason why I name it exception is because it's going to be the exception to being onloaded. So again, we're going to yield return new wait for end of frame, so that before it goes into unloading anything, it just finishes up that frame. And we're going to use a for loop here to look at all the scenes and unload everything unless it's the scene that we just loaded or the VR main scene. So for integer I equals 0, I is less than scene manager dot scene count. And scene manager scene count, you might say the total number of scenes, but that's not the total number of scenes in your project. That's the total number of scenes that are currently loaded at runtime. Not in the editor, but at runtime. So in other words, if I start with VR main scene, which is just the camera, and then I load level 1 additively, there's going to be 2 scenes loaded. The scene manager scene count at that point would be 2 because VR main is loaded and the level 1 is loaded. So scene manager scene count is the number of currently loaded scenes. So I plus plus, increase that value by 1, so we loop through this. Now if scene manager dot get scene at I dot name is not equal to the exception. So what we're saying here is we know that there's 2 scenes currently loaded. So get the scene 0 and give me his name. And if that name is not the exception, so it's not the level that we just loaded, and if the scene at I, whether that's 0, 1, 2, or 3, is not equal to my scene that I created called VR main, then we're going to use scene manager.onload scene, and you would think that you would just onload scene I. For some reason, it doesn't work. If you know why, please tell me in the comment. But what actually works here is to say scene manager.get scene at I, and onload scene will take a name. So if you pass in the name, it will work correctly. Now that our function for onloading levels is complete, let's call it here with start coroutine onload levels. And the exception, which is the scene that we don't want to be onloaded, is going to be scene name, the scene that we just loaded. Obviously, we don't want to unload the scene that we just loaded. So when the script starts, game control is in, because it's static and it's always going to be running no matter which level we're in, it's in the VR main scene. So when this starts up, the first thing we should do is load level 1. Start coroutine, load level. The scene name is level 01. Now when I'm developing, I prefer to put one comment for every single line of code. So please bear with me here. I have a comment on each line of the code. First, we define a static game controller. Then in the moment behavior awake function, we set the control object to this. And then when it starts, we load level 1 so that we have something to look at. That loads the scene, whatever the scene name you pass. Wait to the end of the current frame. Load the scene asynchronously. Onload the previous scenes. Onload all levels except exception and the VR main scene. Onload levels exception. Wait until the end of the current frame. For each scene that is currently loaded, check this scene to make sure it's not exception nor VR main scene. If it's not the newly loaded scene nor VR main, onload the scene. Okay, let's try this thing out. And it says scene level 01 couldn't be loaded because it hasn't been added to the build settings. So we're going to go into scenes and we're going to open up the build settings and let's bring these in. I want VR main to be at 0. In fact, VR main needs to be at 0. It's always going to be loaded, so move VR main to 0. Everything else is going to get loaded after that, so naturally level 1 becomes build order 1 and level 2 will be 2, etc. I'm going to clear the errors and let's check it out. So something's happening, but I don't see sky. So how do you change the skybox? Well, we can go to level 1 and I'm going to create a new object called Skybox Changer. And on this object, I'm going to make a new script called Skybox Changer. And we're going to make a public material called Skybox. And when the scene starts, we're going to say render settings dot skybox is equal to skybox. There's also a lot of other render settings that we might want to set, like fog, reflection. For now, we're just going to say, hey, set the skybox when the scene starts. So when the level 1 gets loaded, that script's going to run that says set the skybox to this material. And I need to save that. And we should have the material here. I'm just going to click and say Skybox. So now if I go to my original VR main scene and I hit play. Okay, great. And we can see in the hierarchy that we have VR main and level 01 loaded. So we got the lighting here, the baked light maps from level 1, and VR main is running with the camera in it and our static game controller. The cool thing about having the static game controller here is if we go into our game controller and we define something like public int gold, so how much gold the player has, and we go back into Unity, this value is going to stay persistent through the entire game, whether we're in level 1 or level 2 or level 3. It won't matter because game controller is static and it's in the VR main scene, which is always loaded. These values are going to stay persistent. So let's say if we had one other value on here called public int score, and the score is something that gets reset after each level, then what you would have to do is when level 1 gets loaded, you're going to need to say gamecontroller.score equals 0. So even though it's an advantage to have some values that are persistent through the entire game, like gold, how much gold the player has in his pocket, a value like score per level is something that you're going to want to reset each time you go into each level. So now that everything's working great, I have my VR main, my level 1. Let's get into changing between level 1 and level 2. So this box is going to act as a button. So I'm going to go into level 1 now. And the cube is going to act as a button. I'm going to add an event trigger to it. And we're going to add a pointer click. So when the pointer clicks, I want to load a level. But from this scene, there's no scripts to call a load level. So on the cube, I'm just going to make a new script called level loader. And level loader is a really simple script with a public function called load level, and we're going to pass in a string scene to load. And this is just going to start a coroutine. Because we've defined game controller static, we can just say game controller.control.load level, and we're going to pass in scene to load. So really simple script with one function called load level. So what I can do is add an event to the pointer click, and I can just drag from the script name here into here and say level loader, load a level, and it gives me a box for a string. I want to load level 02. The problem is level 02 doesn't exist yet. There's an easy way to fix that. I'm going to save scene as, and remember, if I save scene as instead of make a new scene, I'm going to keep all my lighting settings the same, which we really want to have. So save scene as level 02. And level 02 is cool because it has a red ground. And I can see that my baked light map needs to get updated. So I'm going to clear the baked data. There we go. And I'm going to build the new light map. I can see my light maps here in the level 01 and level 02 folder. It looks like I'm going to have to bake my level 01 again because I cleared my baked data. I got to be careful for that when you're dealing with multiple scenes. So in level 01 we have our light map now, and in level 02 we have our light map data. We can see the little icon here is different, so we got our different lighting in each scene. So I'm going to go back into level 02. Here we go. And the only difference going on here is we need to have this cube load level 01. And I'm guessing that the text should both say level 01 as well. If we look in level 1, when we click on this cube, it should load level 02. And if we go to level 2, these cubes should load level 01. Let's go back to our VR main scene and kick it off. And I have no dot. So what you're going to need to do is go to the head, main camera, and go to the Google VR prefabs folder. Under UI, there's a GVR dot prefab. You can move that under the main camera. And now we have a dot on the screen, but it doesn't highlight on the box. And even though we have added a collider and an event trigger, and the reason why is in the VR main scene, we need to add a UI event system. And the event system needs to have the gaze input module, which is moved up above the standalone input module. And now it should work, right? Wrong. And the reason why is this GVR main prefab doesn't have a physics raycaster on the main camera. Now we got a physics raycaster shooting everything. What are we going to have? We're going to have a dot that responds properly. And what we should see here is if I hit level 2, level 1 should be unloaded and level 2 should be loaded. And what has happened? Everything is broken. The night has come and the sky is gray. It's not that bad. Level 2 just hasn't been loaded into the build settings, so we need to make sure we go into the build settings and get level 2. And of course I like to see level 2 at a build order of number 2. Let's see what happens now, guys. Level 2 is loaded. Okay, we got VR main, we got level 2. And now we're back in level 1. Level 2. Level 1. Now, another thing to consider is maybe you don't want to have one level or one scene loaded at a time. Maybe you have one scene for terrain and another for audio and another for trees. And so you could load multiple scenes asynchronously. If that's the case, you're going to have to change up this function a little bit, because this unloads everything except the scene that we're loading. And VR main, this is considering you're just you put everything into one level and you load it like that. So here's one of the really cool things about this. My head is currently looking up in this direction, and it has a rotation of this crazy rotation. Now when I load into level 2 or level 1 here, my head is still in the same rotation inside of level 1. So if you have a VR main prefab in each scene and you load in between, that head rotation value is going to get reset, as well as options such as VR mode enabled. So maybe you support using this outside of a VR viewer in this manner. And in this case, if I were to load into level 2, I still have the VR mode enabled turned off. And if you have a cardboard or a VR main setup in each scene, those settings are going to get lost in between. So, and of course, I got my gold and my score. And this is a really great way to set up your VR camera. I hope this helps you out. And if it does, give it a like, give it a subscribe, tell your friends, get other people excited about developing for VR, and tell them there's tutorials over here to help them out. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being awesome. I'm going to see you guys in the next video. Remember, show me your VR projects. I'm going to start playing those weekly on the channel here. So if you got a cool VR game you're working on or a VR experience, let me know so that I can play it on the channel here and spread the word about it. See you guys soon.